Well, welcome everyone to our sixth and final conversation in this series on leadership and uncertainty. And the last five conversations in this dialogue have all started in very much a similar way. We've brought together a cohort of thoughtful, reflective, contemplative individuals and just said, like, what does uncertainty look like in our world, in our life right now? And then we've had really far-roaming discussions, really based upon who's at the table and the spaces they occupy in our world, and what they see happening around them. An overarching theme, I would say, so far from this series has been for me, this idea of being uncertain about uncertainty, which sounds a little meta, but what I mean is, like, coming to the realization, that when I am aware of my own uncertainty about the future, or about a certain situation, or about the best way to respond to a situation, it's an important prompt. It's an important reminder to listen, because how I understand and engage with uncertainty is not the same way that you or another person understands and responds to uncertainty. So the idea of uncertainty not just being a prompt for that kind of internal reflection about what I see, but also that prompt to listen and to try to get a sense of how others are seeing and feeling and engaging with the moment. So we're going to do that again here in this sixth conversation one more time. So my guests today are Jeremy Nathan Marks. He's an independent tutor and educator. He also works at the Infinity School here in London. Matt Ross is the manager of artificial intelligence at the City of London. Annalise Trudell is the manager of education, training, and research at ANOVA. And Leslie Whiteeye works in Indigenous education and governance for 8 First Nations at an internation table called the First Nations with Schools Collective, a group seeking greater jurisdiction over education in First Nations. And so one question to start, and we'll see where we go in this dialogue. How are you seeing uncertainty in your world right now? Where is it most salient or prevalent in what you see around you? Annalise, can we start with you, and then after Annalise shares a few thoughts, everyone just feel free to jump in.
Sure. So I sort of thought about this in both very personally and then in the sense of my sector and my work. And so I think personally, when the pandemic hit us at that point in time, it felt really familiar in a certain way for me. And I realized at the time that was because I had just been 1 month out of a mat leave. I just returned for 1 month to work. And my entry into motherhood a year before that had been just like a slam into uncertainty. I had no idea what I was doing. I was overwhelmed by fears in a way that I had never been in my life before. This little human had made my heart just explode, and then everything that could go wrong to them. And any parent right now is just shaking their head and like, this is universal. However, I think that is one of the most primordial ways that we understand uncertainty is when we have a kiddo and we start to realize that our heart and our love is something we can't actually control the situation of. And I had to work through those fears. I had to kind of just surrender to it. That's really the word that I've used for my motherhood. And so anyways, when the pandemic hit, that felt so familiar in a certain way, because it was like, I can't stop this risk. I can't control all the variables in a way to make sure that me and my loved ones are safe, that things can go right. I don't know what the next many months are going to be. So there was a familiarity to that sort of helped guide me through that. And I've kind of continued to come back to. So that's sort of just been really interesting to think on a personal level, what we can bring from our personal lives into this really intense space of uncertainty. And then professionally, working in the violence against women sector, or the gender-based violence sector, this moment of uncertainty. And let's layer onto that things that have happened since the pandemic. So let's layer onto that the protests in the States and here. Let's layer onto that the violence that's erupting. I think for us, when we're trying to adapt to that, I've realized the sector was already in crisis. So the crisis of uncertainty layered onto that has just sort of exponentially grown what uncertainty can look like. So we don't know if rates are going to increase or not. We have a set of violence. We have a sense that they are, but we don't know. We don't know if that's going to look like more deaths at the hands of men towards women. We have a sense it may, but we don't. So there's this overwhelming fear, but it almost is also familiar because we were already in that crisis. This is not a problem that just all of a sudden came on us. It's just a problem that got a lot worse, a lot exponentially worse. So both in personal and sort of professional spaces, for me, there's a familiarity to this that you can sort of tease out from other threads.
I guess to add on to the personal impact of it, I'm someone who lives in the future in my mind. I always like to make plans and have lots of ideas and try to make some of them work. And this, I think, was a really good ego check, this entire situation, because someone who lives in the future doesn't like when they realize like where their actual circle of control is. Like it's very humbling to realize all of, not just personal plans, like my wife and I's vacations and weddings that were planned, things like that, but then also all these projects I have planned, all these ideas I have, like you realize what you actually have control over. And working in local government, like a bunch of my time was, redeployed to other things as the government shifted to respond. And it was humbling and nice. And it took me a while to not be stressed out about it. I eventually got to kind of this place where my morning I would remind myself that I don't know what this day will look like, because I think I'm so used to planning my day. And, I would often then get a call and my day or week would change immediately. So it's been nice and humbling. And I found I've been a lot more present as a result, because I don't have plans to distract me as much anymore. I have to kind of be here. So it's been, obviously that comes from a place of, that's my only stressor. Obviously, there's a lot of other people who are going through a pretty large amount of stress. My wife and I are very lucky with the jobs we have and still have, but it's been interesting, that kind of like phenomenological experience of there isn't a future and I don't mean that in a really dark way. I just mean there isn't a future in the same way. Like it's just the present is a lot more present.
I can totally relate to what Matt was saying about this sense of being present. I think I personally know that I'm one that kind of normalizes things, and we've been kind of trained, I think, over time, I think in our communities, that this is just another thing coming at us, and it's not unlike anything we've not gone through before. And so, but what normalization does, though, is it sometimes dulls the innovation or the severity of the issue, right? And so I think the impacts of how we've responded won't be known at this moment, but we know that depending on our responses today, we'll know if we made the right decisions to protect everyone. So personally, I was working from my home anyway, and so this wasn't a big shift for me, but what's been the big shift is everybody else is home, and we're all using the same spaces, and that's been a real blessing, really, in hindsight now, because we've spent more time together in a quality time than a hurried, fast-paced life we were living, going to sporting, getting from school, and we were just transacting in our daily lives. And so to me, this has really brought calm and really reset how we use our time as a family. And so this uncertainty, well, we've been blessed in kind of I think for Den and I, that we work really hard to create stability in our home, and our families have fed that. So I look at those preventative measures seriously and know that I'm blessed to that set me in a good place to handle what's happening right now.
I would, I mean, there's a lot of things that everyone has said that I can certainly relate to. I mean, I have two young kids, one who just turned 6 and the other who is just shy of 2.5. And so when it comes to the having your heartstrings pulled by their vulnerability, I can very much relate to that. What I would add to that personally is that I remember when my older daughter was born 6 years ago, that my partner made the comment to me at the time that she felt that heart explosion, Annalise, that you were talking about. And I remember feeling an element of that, but I don't think I experienced it in quite the same way that she did for a variety of reasons. But what's interesting to me is that I feel like this recent period of uncertainty has actually caused me to go through that, call it in sort of a delayed manner, where with all of the things that are now very unclear about the future, I suddenly found myself kind of walking around my home, looking at my daughters, thinking about their future, and feeling as though somehow the structures around me suddenly felt very surreal, where I thought, I'm not really sure exactly how I'm here, how I got to this point, or how I have some of the things I have, when suddenly things seem so uncertain. So I found myself looking at them and thinking, well, wait a minute. What do how can I envision their future, and what does their future look like to me as far as a strategy is concerned? I mean, do I still feel like I'm in touch with the strategies that I thought that I had in place in order to help prepare them and to take care of them? And that I think really induced this sudden, very acute experience of anxiety, actually looking at them and thinking about my responsibilities to them and my relationship to them. And what I would add to that, also on a very personal note, is that the instability that's been occurring in the United States. I'm from the United States, and my parents and my sister are in the United States. And so one of the things that's been going on is not only the uncertainty of when I'm going to actually be able to see them physically again, but also I find myself thinking about the border in ways that I never have before. And that's sort of an open, that's sort of now an open meditation. I find my relationship to the border has changed a lot. And I don't necessarily have a synopsis at this point that I can offer about where I sit in relation to that. But when the topic of uncertainty came up, I immediately thought about my children. I immediately thought about my family and our future, but I immediately thought of the border and my relationship to that. And that for me, that's a big one. So I realize I'm not talking necessarily yet about the professional aspect of things, because I am very fortunate that I have a job. My partner and I both have jobs, and we're carrying on, which I'm immensely thankful for. But I will admit that at this specific moment in time, it's the things I just mentioned that are really preoccupying me as far as uncertainty is concerned.
All right, well, let me throw this out then for us to contemplate and consider. So just yesterday evening, like last night, very recently, I had this very similar conversation, and in the conversation last night, my friend Patrick, who lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, Ariel Kabaga, who is our city councilor here in London, both of whom are Black, both of whom who feel this moment in a way that is different from the way I feel from my position in the world. We're in the same world, but I mean, we are living in these different realities that bring us to this moment in different ways. And so I'm wondering how you are feeling about, seeing the good that this moment of uncertainty has raised in your own perspective. So I'm thinking about, as has been mentioned a few times here, this heightened appreciation for family and time together. And at the same time, where are you in holding the positives that come, the disruptive positives that come with having that kind of ego check, having that certainty check, having that, having those assumptions I have about the future kind of called into question, and thus forcing this kind of reevaluation of my life and priorities, recognizing that there are positives in that, and yet realizing that it's in a now a global context that is so unsettling, dangerous even, for so many people. Anyone want to respond to that? How those things are being held in tension for you?
I mean, I don't have a good response of how they're held in tension, other than that they are being held in tension. Like, I find it always kind of like a cognitive dissonance experience. Like, I flash back and forth between, oh, it's nice that I'm more present, or nice that my wife and I get more time together. But then I'm always like looking at the data. Like, I update a bunch of models every day with WHO data because I love data. It's part of my job. And all it does is just draw the sharp contrast of like how many radically different experiences there are across the world with this pandemic. And so I don't think I hold it well. I think, like, if I'm being honest and like a little ashamed, that I start to tune it out because I don't know what to do. But I try to like not do that like intentionally, but I think it just, there's this like overwhelming amount of kind of negative information, and I realize that I don't really know what to do about some of it. When there is tangible things you can do, ways I can donate or contribute in some way, we do that. But yeah, it's weird being kind of locked down. Like Jeremy's mention of like the relationship with the border. I don't think I ever appreciated that I can't leave. Do you know what I mean? I'm in a state where I can't leave my country, and I've never experienced that before. And so it just, again, it's the ego check. So I don't think I'm managing it well. I think I oscillate back and forth and try to do things for self-care, which is why I'm in my garage. Being closer to outside makes me happier, but that's the way I try to manage it, which is more of a Band-Aid, not really a solution. But
I found myself last week when things were really escalating in the United States. I'd gotten a message from my sister. This was after what happened in Minneapolis, and she just sent me a message late at night. I actually found out what had happened from her, and she was very upset, and she was telling me about her feelings. And over that, I would say over the couple of days after that, I found myself just kind of by instinct going to a voice or voices that I feel that I have a certain amount of faith and trust in. And so I navigated to James Baldwin, who's a writer that I've been a big fan of for a very long time, and just kind of let my instincts take me to his book, The Fire Next Time. And one of the things that he talks about in there, which really is resonating with me right now, is that he goes into a great deal of depth about how African Americans know so much about white America, and white America knows so little about African Americans. And he goes into depth about that, a great detail about that. And the thing that I cannot and I will not paraphrase Baldwin, he's too eloquent. I won't presume to be able to do that. But what I took from that, though, to answer your question, James, is that I found myself asking myself again, how much do I not know? How insulated am I really? Not simply because I choose to be, but because of who I am, my position in society, obviously privileges that I possess, but also just really asking myself the question, how much do I not know, and how much do I really not see about the present? And I think where I find myself really wondering about that too is the fact that because I work from home and have had to work from home, and because I have the luxury of working from home and can go out into my backyard and spend time with my daughters and my partner and so forth, is that how much, I mean, that's all very good fortune right there, but how much does that reinforce all these things that I don't know? That the things that I use to take comfort and can feel gratitude for are at the same time, and I don't want to give them up, mind you, but at the same time are potentially reinforcing my own ignorance. And so I find myself thinking about that a lot right now.
I think when you had originally asked it, I where my mind went was that the notion of having a certain life, of certainty in your life, of some ability to predict and know, is a highly privileged space. And it's not that you can have uncertainty. It's not that privilege and uncertainty are not able to coexist, because in times of, say, someone that you love dying, or there are ways that those do come together, but privilege enables some certainty and some sort of masking of that risk. And I think for those of us that sit in a ton of privilege, the pandemic has sort of opened our eyes to a little slit of what that can actually look like. The sort of what's occurring now around a really explosive and intense race conversation is opening our eyes, for those of us with privilege, around that kind of certainty that we've been masked in. So I think that's helpful. I think obviously it's not enough. We have to continue to broaden that in, but we will never know. We will never know that other experience. And it is both completely overwhelming, and you cannot take that on. Like when I hear about you delving into WHO data on a daily basis, I'm okay. Cannot take that on mentally. But I also know what allows me to take it on in ways that I can actually process and then hopefully change me is, again, my motherhood. My motherhood for me has allowed me like this superpower of empathy. And I do think it is. I think you can absolutely have empathy without being a mother. Good Lord, yes. But I think that it does heighten that for you. And I think this is vulnerable for me to say, and potentially also highly problematic, and yet it is the truth. The part of the George Floyd story that really got me in my like core was when he called out for his mother. And then that broke down all the differences for me. That just made me be like, oh, like I don't have words. And that was it. That was the point. So I think all the data, all the stories, all the awful news, you almost do shut down because it is too much. But what is your entry point that allows you to keep opening that space? And for me, that's my motherhood, and when I can find those empathy lines.
So, I mean, for me, when I think about like how I personally responded, I felt like many of you where I have relatives in the States, and that border has always been a place of contention on every level, from a family to a people to our community in terms of how we cross it. So this idea, I'm sad to say, is that what I'm seeing and feeling as I process this over the days, and as each day builds on the other, I'm settled with the fact that this is a reckoning. That what those structures were that you believe were so protective of your lives is now impacting you, and now you're feeling what we've been feeling for centuries, in terms of how I'll say power situates itself in these things called democracies. And I mean that that there really does have to be a real reflection on if in fact you are living in a democracy, because our experience to date has been, no, you're not. You are very much living in a very highly structured power base that privileges some over others. And I think what you're finding is it's not just along racial lines. It's also around haves and have-nots. And so when I think about our work at the First Nation with Schools Collective, and I struggle with, do I go and help my Madej family in Minneapolis? You know, they're hosting jingle dress. They're dancing in their healing ways through the jingle dress. Can I even do that? And how, and then what does that mean? Does it pull away from the work that we're already doing at the collective, which is work that happened long before the pandemic? And then I check myself as a leader and realize that's what, as leaders in Indigenous communities, we've been spreading ourselves so thin, trying to address every kind of epicenter of crisis, that we've actually lessened or weakened our ability to make change. And so I've been really as I get more and more thinking about leadership, I realize that there's enough work for everybody to do in their own lane. If we stay focused in our own lanes, we'll be stronger, better, more technical. And so my lane is curriculum development and education system transformation. And I get to work with incredible leaders in 8 communities that if my role is to stay the course and to keep messaging this and letting them know that this is the exact work you're doing. You're undoing those colonial structures that told you your people were savage and had no civilization and had nothing to offer. And now you're recreating and rating curriculum that says the opposite. So just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing good work. You're already contributing in a way that is systemic and long-term.
I wanted to just quickly upvote something Annalise said, that I'm someone who gets trapped in my mind around, I think, the paradox that there's this risk that we mask with whatever certainty that we want to have, and to the point of like you have a privilege to have that mask and have that certainty, and this whole crisis has kind of like pulled that out from under us. And I always get trapped in that. It's like, there is this uncertainty and you have to explore it, but without some certainty, or at least the strife for certainty, like you kind of spiral into depression, or at least I've found that in my own life. But you like collapse the two together in like a perfect way. Is like empathy is the entry point, because empathy is a way of kind of being in uncertainty with another person. And I don't know, I really like that as a way to kind of collapse these tensions, is like the empathy is the approach. I just thought that was really cool.
Empathy within bounds, because too much empathy does lead to burnout. And I think on my professional level, I do see that. So, and that actually links for me what you were saying, Leslie, that I really liked, was that sometimes the work, so from my vantage point professionally, like, how are we ever going to end gender-based violence? It is only increasing. So what we're doing is clearly not actually working. So what do you do with that? And yet recognizing the work that I'm doing and the lane that I am doing is contributing. It is doing good. There's tons of work, and I don't have to try to attach myself to all of that. So I don't know that I can actually honestly have empathy for everything. I actually don't think I can do that, but I can find my ins and kind of follow those.
This idea of empathy as being an entry point, as we said, and then Leslie, the frame around, and Annalise spoke to this too, this frame around having this sense that you're contributing, and having a sense that you both said you have a lane, and you can see how what you're doing in some way connects to the future or the issue about which there is uncertainty, which are all futures and all issues. But how this idea of being able to be self-actualized, in a sense, as someone who is contributing, someone who has something to give, who sees the uncertainty and sees themselves as being responsive to it. We have this idea of here empathy, being a crucial step towards that. But I'm wondering if we could delve into that just even a little bit more. What are some of the other prerequisites, I guess the question is, for have that sense of contributing? Because I'm wondering if there's a certain privilege even in there, to be able to look at a situation of uncertainty and then to say, yes, I myself am contributing towards a solution or a way forward. Does everyone have that opportunity? So anyone want to take on? I'm not asking a question. I'm talking out loud. Empathy, sense of contribution, uncertainty. Where is this colliding for anyone else?
I can offer you a thought on that, just again, based on my own personal experience. So I do get to work with a lot of students one-on-one, and often in a sort of Socratic relationship where we will read something together, and the conversation, of course, will be based around questions. And one of the things that I've come to think a lot about over the years of doing this is of course the nature of the questions that you ask people, how those questions are framed, what your own underlying assumptions are. And I remember reading something about a year ago about how, in the Socratic model of always asking somebody questions, there's a tyranny embedded in there, where if you're constantly asking questions and you're not actually offering answers yourself, you actually are acting in a rather tyrannical way. If you can constantly put the other person on the defensive and are asking them to give you answers to questions that you've posed, that's not, that doesn't work. That's also not empathetic at all. I've heard that described as just being a game of who is smarter. And so the person who controls the conversation gets to prove that they're smarter. Now, having said that, I've witnessed that kind of interaction in so many places, not just in a teacher-student relationship, but then in relationships that I've had, or interactions I've had with other people. And so where empathy for me really enters into it, both as an educator but also just as a human being with the capacity to do some good, is I think a lot about the questions that I ask people in conversations. Is my curiosity about a person or something, is it appropriate at that moment in time? But also, am I aware of the structure and the content and the context of how I'm asking a question as well? And so to give you a concrete example of this, I've seen, for instance, there was, I came across something once where it was trying to have kids grapple with the institution of slavery. And it was specifically put within the context of the American Constitutional Convention, and where the question was to give kids a sense of the dilemma of ratifying the Constitution. It was posed as, you ratify the Constitution, which includes the 3/5 compromise, where you have people who only get 3/5 of personhood, and that you do it in order to ratify that Constitution to protect the country from foreign invaders, or do you reject it? And that, do you ratify it with the expectation that down the road slavery will be addressed, or do you reject it because the 3/5 compromise is immoral? And it's an interesting way of grappling with the question. But at the same time, I also looked at that and went, but wait a minute, you're putting the student in the position of the privileged legislator who gets to decide whether or not slavery is an issue that eventually will be addressed, but by whom and when, and on whose agenda and on whose time scale. And so what I thought was interesting about the question was, on the one hand, I could see that there was an honest effort to try to grapple with the issue of moral compromise. But on the other hand, I thought, yeah, but you're putting someone in a very narrow position of power, and also you're not incorporating into that. I mean, how would that be if you asked somebody, for example, who was the descendant of slaves, how they would answer that question? And so I thought that the context in which the question was posed and the nature of the question itself, thinking about who actually gets to make this decision, really opens wide, I think, from an educational standpoint, this conundrum of, okay, well, how do you ask a question and pose a moral choice that you can be sure is not in some way reinforcing a lack of empathy? And by that, I mean that where I think their lack of empathy could enter into that is that you could treat a pressing moral question in a very abstract and as a thought problem, first and foremost, rather than that it could be reduced to a thought problem. And I found when I looked at that and read that, I thought, this is a real dilemma. And how do you inject empathy into that specific type of discussion?
The first thing I wanted to ask Jeremy as you were talking is, well, I should ask everyone in this conversation what they think the moral question of our moment is. And then I realized that's not a very empathetic question to ask people on the spot. I think that's a great, I mean, but I think what I hear you getting at is what are questions that we should be asking right now, and not questions such as what is the ultimate moral question of our present moment, which would be a question that I would require, some time to go and really try to grapple with. I'm terrified of a question like that in the immediate moment without time to think and explore. So let's not say the moral question of the moment, but maybe we could reflect on, what are some of the most important questions that we should be asking in this moment, and let's cast that in the leadership frame, as people representing, various sectors. We're representing various institutions in this discussion. What do you see, or what are the questions that you're hearing that you feel are some of the most important right now?
I want to respond to both those questions, what Jeremy's brought up about the questioning. I heard this morning on the news that there's protesting going on in London, England, and the questions they're raising of their government is, why didn't you teach us about colonialism? And I was just kind of, my immediate reaction was just to have a big smile on my face, because those are questions we've been raising as Indigenous educators from the beginning, and now to not have to bear kind of that brunt of the work to ask the question, to finally have the people who come from those histories to ask that of themselves, is a real, to me, a move in the right direction. And so if you were asking me, James, what's a good question for this time and age, I would say, can you go back and let's talk about what the doctrine of discovery means, and why has it permeated the world in such a significant way, and how do you unravel that? And then what does terra nullius mean, and why, and what are those very principles that our very structures that we live in today derive from those two principles, and what is it about those things that are no longer and shouldn't have been relevant then or now? And so if you were to ask me that, those are two questions I'd say let's talk about.
I think my answer to the questions would be around inequality, because I think the broad question is like, what level of inequality are we willing to tolerate? This crisis is drawn into sharp contrast what inequality exists, and have laid the seeds to make it much, much worse. It's already getting much, much worse. And that seems to be the question for me. There's so many radically different experiences that we're having around kind of the haves and the have-nots. And I don't know, like, different countries are treating it differently. Different countries are trying to keep the haves and the have-nots as close together as they can. Obviously, there's a lot of systemic issues why that's almost, not going to take place. And not saying I'm defending those systemic issues. It's just I'm seeing all the kind of lobbyists come out from the woodwork the more we try to support those who are suffering the most from this crisis. And that seems to be the question for me. Like, what are we going to do to stop this from being like the crisis of our generation, right? Like, this is a crisis now, but the seeds that are being laid right now are going to continue this on and exasperate already boiling over issues for decades to come. I don't mean to be like all alarmist and crisis mentality, but like that's the thing that I'm like most afraid of as the result of this.
I want to weave a few questions that have been asked at this point. So James, a few questions ago, you had sort of said, is there privilege in even being able to think about being a contributor right now, like doing work in your lane? And yes, absolutely. And so what are some of the pressing questions that sort of drive that? For me, like, if your home life is it unraveling. And if that's because there's tensions in the home and there's violence in the home, if that's because you have a lack of basic necessities being met, if that's because your mental health is just not in a place where you can be contributing, I think there's multiple axes of that we need to recognize. I think in some of the podcasts that I have listened to, there's been a really good deep analysis around some of the isms been brought to this conversation. But I think that there are some others to be added to that. And I think violence is one of the ones that we're not thinking through quite as well. We know right now that 1 in 10 women are worried about that in their home in Canada. And that's astounding. And that will be completely debilitating in the sense of what I can contribute, how much empathy I can put out when I am just not good in. So I think we need to be sort of reflecting on, yes, the privilege that takes to even look out into empathy, and the layers of privilege that is, because that can be privilege in the sense of class, but a complete lack of privilege in the sense of violence. And so how do those intersect? And then I think on a really meta level, for me, where my mind goes is there's been all kinds of really good talk. Like everyone seems to be talking AO right now, anti-oppression. Everyone is talking the right thing. Everyone's posting like, thou shalt now do this is sort of the language being posted. But even on a government level, like in terms of my sector, we've had more funding in the last couple months from multiple levels of government to sort of say, like, we know that this is a problem in the pandemic, cash. And okay, now in a year from now, what do we do with that? In a year from now, do we have the sustained energy and the sustained ability to hold those moments of empathy on an individual level to keep that thou shalt not tone happening that we can sort of propel? And on a government level, I don't even know where to go with that in my mind, because we are of course going into a financial deficit, and we are of course going into more need social service wise than ever before. And I don't know how to reconcile those.
I think the only thing that I would add, because I mean, all of the questions that have been raised are, I think, are all vital. The one that just keeps popping into my mind is I've had a number of students say to me, not only during this pandemic, but even prior to it, that they don't know that they're going to have a future. And they typically talk about that not only from a climate crisis point of view, but they also talk about it from a financial point of view, whether or not they'll ever be able to retire, whether they will ever have the job security necessary to retire. And then when you throw the pandemic question into that even further, that even deepens that anxiety. And so I've found myself wondering, and this relates, Leslie, to what you said coming out of London, England, is that there's a part of me that's sort of wondering whether or not this moment is going to be the moment where more and more of, I don't like to say us, but let me just say people like myself who have not been traditionally accustomed to feeling such vulnerability have a greater degree of empathy in our lives, because we recognize the fact that the distinctions to a certain extent between us and people who have traditionally been more vulnerable are in fact false distinctions. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm trying to gloss over history here or differences based on gender or race or class. I don't mean it like that. I mean it more in terms of the blindness that I think exists, which is the idea of that affects them. That doesn't affect me. This doesn't enter into my world and my thinking. And I've encountered a lot of students who don't feel that way, who really do feel vulnerable and identify with vulnerability. And so that's a big question for me, is that are we at a point where are more and more people going to recognize that these barriers between us that are, of course, constructed around colonialism or constructed around the isms are in fact false, that they are divisive in order to maintain structures of power, which of course are highly violent and exploitative. And so I find myself thinking about that a lot.
One of the things that we've come to learn in the work of the collective is that as we reconstruct and what Jim Dumont refers to as re-search, our pulling our medicine bundles together, that we come from a very rich history and place of values and principles that are set out in our creation story. And if we remember that and we look to seek that knowledge, we'll remind ourselves as a people of what our purpose was here as we were placed on the earth. And those very structures that were put in place by our ancestors to live out those principles are the very things that will heal not only us, but our relationship to other peoples. And then recognize that, like yourself, you come from a place of people that has a story of creation that is setting the stage for how it is you act out your creation story. And so I think there's something to be said about the coming together of those stories and recognizing, sure, we've got distinctions and it's not us against them, but we all have distinct gifts as a people, but we don't have all of them that are necessary to live a good life. And so we have to rely on each other's knowledges as peoples to chart a new path. So my worry, though, is that in the example you share, Jeremy, what if we end up seeing ourselves as distinct and separate and us against them, which has been always the case in terms of a pattern of behavior and solving problems. Instead, we see you're a people that has knowledges that probably could lend some insight to how we move forward and adjust, and we both adapt to one another's new knowledges to create what our elders who tell us about the prophecies talk about, a new people. So I think I always go back to that now as a person when I'm struggling and trying to grapple and not get mad and hardened about the work. I go back to the principles and values of my people and look to my creation story that always tells us that we're a kind people. And the very basis of who we are is to do only 7 things. Elder Louis de Bossiguet from Chagin, who left the collective with, what is the reason for existence for Anishinaabe? Well, you secure your nourishment for yourself. You have food relations that reinforce your community. You build shelter for yourselves. You reinforce those relationships that create shelter and give you a safe place to be. You teach your young, build education systems that reinforce those intergenerational principles. You heal your sick. They come first. They need your help. You bury your dead. You honor that life. And then you defend all that you love. And then finally, just be grateful for the perfect generosity of Creator. And that's the only purpose you have on life. And when I think about those students who are struggling to answer the question, where is my future? Make sure they get to define feeling not like they can live up to that. And I think they have a right to define it. It's just that simply to take care of their families. That's a real important vision of the future.
It's good to echo that. I like the return to just do your human thing. Like I found throughout the last 2 months, I've just really started noticing like the relationship with my wife, my like tiny garden, like my the friends that I care most about, and a lot of these kind of superficial things have really dropped away in my life, intentionally and also not intentionally, and it just kind of reminded me of I guess the human thing that I can do, and I'm very satisfied when I do those things, and it's like a reminder that you don't need to do more than that. So I really like that.
Leslie, you have such wisdom. I don't know that I want to even say anything. I want to finish on that because I wanted to jump in and be all pessimistic, that we were just going to shit, everything was bad. And I hear you. And I realize like, I have those moments of insight in my own everyday life where I realize like, yes, my little 16-month-old and my wife, that's it. The rest is good. They're what matter. We're healthy and we're relatively happy. And I think there's such wisdom in sort of sticking to that when we link in uncertainty, to start with, like, that's just such a grounding. That's such a really good grounding to move forward in this, because the big systems need work. But what can we bring to them? We can bring our grounded self and our sense of what we can contribute and knowing what is important.
I feel like that vitalizes our interactions, and I think that if we have vital interactions with people, I really do believe that that makes a tremendous difference. And so I think coming from a place of grounding definitely does that.
Are there any other thoughts or things people would like to share as we I say wrap this up in a very loose sense, because in all of these conversations, exploring uncertainty does not mean that the conversation concludes in any kind of ultimate definitive way generally. So any final things that you would like to share that's, you know, that's come up for you as we've had this dialogue?
Only my gratitude that this conversation can take place and I can be a part of it, because I'm aware of, in a time of social distancing, how it's so easy for me to get stuck in my head and to lose perspective based on my own limited vision and my own anxieties. And so I'm just very grateful to be able to be a part of a discussion like this, because it takes me out of myself, which is really important. And so I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
I'm really grateful that we were able to weave in quite a bit of personal into this conversation and really sort of stay grounded from that vantage point. I think it's really easy when we talk about leadership in particular to think about a very professionalized version of that. And it was important to me that not be where I come from. And I'm glad that kind of the conversation really rooted itself there. So thank you.
Lee said, I really appreciate us staying a lot in the personal there. And you guys sharing so openly about your, you know, how you're thinking this through at home and what does it mean in your own personal lives. It helps me to understand too that, you know, we're all struggling with this and the space you've created, James, for that to happen, that have been shared already, just to be able to talk out loud about these things.
Yeah, my thanks to all you, because this was, like, I think mildly therapeutic for me. You know, I was doing a bit of thinking prior to this in the morning, and a lot of the things I was thinking were extremely abstract about uncertainty. And I'm very glad that we didn't really go there. We kind of went to all of our own experiences, and by the end of it, I feel more grounded than an interesting output of a conversation about uncertainty. So thank you.
Well, the feeling of gratitude is 100% shared by me, and I am so thankful to have people like you in my life who are willing to log into a conversation and just, you know, hold loosely hold loosely what we know and what we feel in this moment. So I really do appreciate your participation in this, and your sentiments in conclusion are only thoughts that I would wish to echo as well. So thank you so much to all of you, and if you have further thoughts that come up as you reflect on these, please let me know. Let's not let the structure of these conversations be some kind of like limiting factor in how we continue to work these things through together. So thank you so much.